So Bev, tell me what it was like. What was it like for you growing up in Wolverhampton?
Wolverhampton was pretty diverse. There was a sizable West Indian community, very sizable South Asian community, specifically Sikh, and then of course, you know, white people, lots of different people from all kinds of places, you know, traditionally, and everyone seemed to rub along okay. As a child, one of my earliest memories was we had two elderly neighbours, old people, and let's just say one of them wasn't very keen on us at all, at all. They, before I was born, before my older sister was born, the one elderly lady called the council because they couldn't understand how this young black couple had managed to buy a house on their street. Wow. Which was interesting, wow. And they assumed that there must be some kind of nefarious goings on behind it. So, of course, that was squashed. As a child, I can remember the neighbours grumbling a bit. You know, if we were on the piano playing, they'd have a moan about it, and there'd be a lot of your lot. You know, that phrase, your lot. You've come here, you've come and you've took over, you know, that kind of. I'd be like, yeah, whatever. You know, but at school and that whole experience, that was not so bad for me because I was a child who, I wanted to learn. I was very bookish, still am, if I'm honest with you. That willingness to learn and that willingness to be the eager kid at the front put me in good stead with most teachers, but not all. I remember having lots of racist chanting in maths class as a primary school child.
Maths class.
Interestingly enough, as an adult thinking back now, I think it's because the teacher was entirely indifferent to the plight of the one black child who was audibly getting, you know, this racist abuse in her classroom. And when I would, even though she could hear it, she'd carry on teaching like nothing happened. And then I'd say, you know, in a break, oh, they're saying horrible things. They're calling me Sambo, you know. And she'd be like, oh, Beverly, will you sit down? Go away. You know,
how did that make
ignore it.
But how did that make, I know you were young, but how did that make you feel?
I couldn't understand it.
Right.
I was so, my parents are, you know, Christian people. If something is not right, you tell the teacher and it is their duty to deal with it. Only I did all of that and they didn't deal with it. They didn't help me. In the end, I was removed from that class. So I remember one specific time when I went up and said, because I just was persistent, I was like, I'm going to keep saying, you know, they're teasing me, they're saying horrible things. And the one day she says, oh, we'll just call them Whitey then. And I remember even then, as a you know, a young child, I thought, no, that's not right. That's not right at all. Of course, everything changed when I eventually told my mum and dad. Then things really did change. But it's funny how those negative things stay with you.
Yeah. Even
as an adult, you know, I can still see myself in the class, the one child who was black in this classroom, no other child of colour, just me, and just having all of this chanting, and the way it made me feel, I felt tiny and insignificant and nothing, and but you know, I had a lot of self-belief because I knew I was a smart kid. I knew I would sing, you know, I had other things that I could hold on to and would give me confidence, but maths, no.
It's interesting because, Oswald, I'll come to you next. I'm also raised in London, and I was also, like Bev, the only black girl in my class, and it was about 6 or 7 when people in the class made me realise that I was a different colour. I hadn't experienced it before I changed schools and suddenly was the only black kid in my school. And you're right, it's shocking, but people assume in London that doesn't happen. But what was your experience growing up in London?
For me, I was brought up in North London, Muswell Hill to start off with, and then Wood Green. My memories growing up, well, I remember I can't know how old I was, maybe as 4 or something like this. And I remember on our street with the only black family, I think probably in the whole area. And there was a family who had an Alsatian dog. And this basically was trained to bark at black people. And basically, I just have a memory of my dad picking me up and this dog trying to bark or bite me, right?
Wow.
And so that's another reason why I've got a thing about dogs. So, I don't have pets, but yeah. And so that was my first memory. And then when we moved to Wood Green, I lived on this block, which, again, we were the only black family in the area. And there were skinheads on one corner and teddy boys on another corner. And so from the age of, I think, maybe 8 or 9 years old, going to school every day was a nightmare, stress. And it's interesting because, I had to develop a whole series of techniques to get past the house. So I tried all kinds of things. The invisible man. There's a screen around me that makes me invisible. The other thing is if you show too much fear, then you got picked on. Showed too much arrogance or strength, you got picked on. So it was constantly balancing my energy just to get past the house. It was interesting when there was no one there. It was like, But that's kind of my kind of upbringing was really learning how to navigate that sort of level of racism, and then also, because we're talking about the 70s and 80s. And then there was the race riots as well, and which I have an older brother, and he made a point about you're not allowed out of the house while this is going on. So for me, there was always this built-in need to change perceptions. So it's kind of the reason why I chose what I do and why I set my shop on Savile Row. It was because of that. Because as a kid, dealing with that every day was hard.
And how do you feel about it now, having your shop in the middle of Savile Row? We'll talk a little bit later about the fashion industry full stop, but having that shop in Savile Row, did it make you feel as though, do you know what, I've been through this before, I can deal with this, I'm going to make a point and I will succeed at this?
Yeah, probably as a kid I developed a series of techniques, so I didn't really think about how I was going to achieve it. I just knew I had to do it.
Yeah.
And I just went through the steps. Mm-hmm. And I remember going to Savile Row when I was 18, buying my fabrics. Of course, they wouldn't give me the same opportunity.
You say, of course. There are a lot of people that won't get what that means. Explain what you mean when you say, of course.
Of course, meaning is already me as... The good thing is they didn't know how old I was, so that's kind of ageless, which was good. But the reality of it is there was this a wall saying no. And because I'd been accustomed to no, I just kept at it. And that's why, again, I picked Savile Row, because even when I finally opened my shop, which was, I was around 26, 27 when I opened it, I already knew that I had to bring something unique to the proposition, and there's a respect that I had to give to the establishment. And if I could actually bring something unique and new that actually moved the concept of Savile Row in the suit forward on a global level, that contribution would be recognized. And the fact that I was black or whatever would be kind of not considered, but I knew what it meant for the black community doing that.
Chris, you are also a Londoner.
Yeah.
Did you have teddy boys at the end of your street as well?
We had, to be honest with you, I was brought up in Holloway, and it's quite a melting pot there. We had a lot of Irish families, we had Greek, black families, so it was quite a melting pot. But the thing I remember, one of the things I remember the most about growing up in those days was the normality of racism, the normality of being called darky or word Sambo or words to that effect, and continually being ready to have a fight or being continually ready to be stopped, because it was the days of the sus laws and stuff like that. And you know, from being in the infants, you know, back in the 60s, you know, where there was no holds barred, you know, you just had to accept it. I mean, fortunate for me that because it was such a melting pot, there were other black children in the class, but trying to navigate yourself around that, where the teachers themselves use openly racist language and openly dealt with things in a way that wouldn't be accepted now. And obviously, trying to be a footballer was always difficult in those days. There weren't many footballers. You're looking up to people like Clyde Best and Cyril Regis and Brendan Batson and Laurie Cunningham and people like that, who were not that older than I am now, but they were actually footballers at that time. And you know, things like I remember going. I used to play for Charlton as a young kid, and going from Holloway all the way to South East London was like a massive trek in those days. But you know, obviously I know Charlton's a diverse club, but this was my journey there. You know, I remember standing on the bridge, waiting for the train to come, and having to sprint onto the train, otherwise I'd be getting chased by people. If there happened to be any skinheads on the platform, you could be getting chased. So you'd get in there, you'd get your cabin, and hope that the next station that some people wouldn't come on and either spit at you or talk to you in a way that would make you scared. But that wasn't the only thing, because then when you get home and you get off the train and you're walking home, then you might get stopped. So that was a constant journey. But one of the things was you couldn't tell your mum, because she wouldn't let you go. So you'd have to make out that everything was fine. So those ordeals, to be honest with you, at the time you wouldn't see them as ordeals. You just see them as part of life, because you knew you had to navigate around it. And if you wanted to get where you wanted to get to, getting to the football where you're going to be training and being with other people that love the sport was actually your main goal. So that obstacle course on the way home was just part of the journey.
Yeah. I mean, what's quite unifying with all three of the stories, I'm sure it would be the same with you two as well, is the fight you had when you were younger seeps through to when you're older, and that fight never quite leaves. You know, do you feel like you were also battling in Reading as well, Karen?
I hear stories of resilience just listening to everyone, and it's no wonder we are so resilient as a community, because we've had it from day one, and it's something that you've lived with, and it's your everyday experience. And look, I grew up in Reading, which was known as Mini Barbados, because there were so many people from Barbados that sort of settled in Reading in the 60s. And it was just one of the weird things that the house that my mum and dad bought, the school boundaries, we were in Oxfordshire, and next door we were in Berkshire. So I was then shipped out to school in Oxfordshire, and I sort of went to a primary school which was in a tiny little Oxfordshire village. And that school, there's 4 black people at the school, in the entire school, and I have an older sister, so she's 3 years older.
She was the other one.
Yeah, so we were 2 of the 4. And I think she had it harder than me, because she went before me. So there was my sister and myself, and then the Wayne brothers. that was the 4. And she sort of cleared the path for me. So anybody that picked on me, my sister would steam in. She'd be there. I mean, she'd literally be there. So she cleared the path for me, but we both learned to be incredibly resilient. And you do take that from childhood into work life, because...
What kind of things did you have at school?
Look, it's normally about, the prominence of your backside compared to the other kids. There was always comments about the size of my backside or the size of my lips. So there was though, whereas people pay for lips like mine now. But there was always those sort of comments when you were a kid, because people noticed difference. And I was told by mum and dad to always celebrate difference. Don't shy away, Don't try and blend in. You can't. So celebrate difference. And so I'm fortunate that I had confidence as a child because I had that foundation from my mum and dad. But I was also quite good at sport at school. So I used to win all the trophies for school. So that gave you a little bit of slack because you were the person that was in the netball team, you were the person in the hockey team, you were the person that was winning the trophies for athletics. So that gave you that sort of competitiveness and that focus to win, which I absolutely do have, actually weirdly made you popular in a scenario where things were difficult and you were one of the only ones. That's a difficult situation that you have to face, but being good at something, being able to win something for the others, that changes the dynamic slightly.
That is so true, so true. Simon, lots of stories here.
Sure.
And you are a Leicester boy.
I am.
And you were nodding away when everyone was giving their examples. What was it like in Leicester?
Well, I was brought up on a council estate. I was fostered, then adopted by white parents who were just wonderful. I think in many ways I am my mum. But you know, in the 60s, it was a challenge. It was a real challenge. I mean, I think two things stick out to me looking back. One was discovering that I was black. I'd been to the Scouts, and we went on this trip with all the other cubs, actually, not Scouts, the little ones. And there was me and this other guy, Ian Arden, another black guy, and we entered the three-legged race. And I remember they said, go, and then me and this Ian Arden, this my friend, we was off, and we just glided, and we were looking around and we saw the white kids, and I realized that's being black. And you know, it was a great feeling. But the other side of it was that we'd be in the playground, and then we'd see these skinheads come by, and they'd be singing "Send the Wogs to Vietnam." And I knew they were talking about me. I knew that I was that focus. And I remember going home to my mum, and I said to my mum, why do they want to send me to Vietnam? And she took me in her arms and cried. And I think it was, you know, for her, a son to be subject to. I mean, I didn't know that Vietnam, there was at war, but that was the song they used to chant. And I think, like, you know, the rest of friends here, that resilience and strength that you need to get over that. My older brother taught me how to fight very early on. And so that was a string to your bow. And then once you knew you could fight your way out of problems, people had a second thought about giving you trouble. But you always knew that you needed a mechanism to deal with the stuff that was thrown at you.
And being different is something I would assume you had to deal with when it came to being in politics as well. And that needs a hell of a lot of resilience, I would probably say. How do you think that's impacted on you? Why did you decide that politics was the way that you were going to change the world?
I mean, well, it wasn't politics. I mean, I wasn't interested in politics. I mean, I left school, I was a car mechanic, came to London, got into advertising. But you're always confronted with injustice. You're always thinking something's not right, something's not right. And I had a feeling of insecurity, so I went back to school, I went back to university to get a degree. I went to Latin America to study and seen people dying for their cause. And I came back, still in my 20s, and said, I have no excuse not to change our world. And then just dived into politics. But, you know, having dived into politics, I'd meet reasonable people that say, yeah, we're all together. You know, can you keep the blackness quiet? Because, you know, we're all the same. We've all got the same blood. And I'm thinking, no, it's not the same. We need a black voice. We need to tackle this monster of injustice.
But people still say that.
They still do. And, you know, maybe we'll talk about it later. This is a moment that might see dramatic change. Our biggest challenge is denial of what we've laid bare, denial of our experiences, which still many confront today. Mm-hmm. And I'm hoping, if anything's to change in this monumental historical time, it'll be less of denial and how we solve these problems.
Now, denial is something I would say is huge within the entertainment industry, Bev. In the last few weeks, since the Black Lives Matter protests here really took hold, we've had some really hard, emotional and for some enlightening conversations and statements from the likes of Misha B and Alexandra Burke, for instance. What was your experience in the entertainment industry when you were making your way and making strides and trying to get to the top?
The first thing that I can tell you, when I released the very first single, Flavour of the Old School, white label, 94, I was so proud, you know, I was only 21, I was still at uni, I was at the last year of uni, and I can remember there was a little bit of media interest at the time in this kid from, you know, local from Wolverhampton. There was a paper, a Midlands-based paper, wanted to write about me, and so I remember giving my interview, and I was so excited because it's the first interview, you know, and that. And they took pictures of me and some of my mates from school. I had a very diverse crowd, so that was a nice picture. And I remember opening the paper and looking at it, and the piece I read was not my life at all. It was like they had copied and pasted what they thought was the stereotypical black experience and just superimposed it onto me. So I was talking about the fact that mum and dad had this lovely house on this lovely road, to the point where the neighbours were like, how the hell can you live here, you know? Oh no, that became, you know, tower block and single parent, so my dad wasn't even in the picture.
No.
And you know, and they had to struggle and had to fight, and just this whole complete rags to riches story, which was rooted in a racial stereotype. It was not me, and that was lesson number one. That's me right out the gate. So I was like, okay, right, okay, so I see that I'm going to have to navigate my way in the music industry, you know, just a little differently than perhaps I thought. Perhaps just having, you know, this whole prerequisite of having a talent and everything else should fall into place. It's not going to work like that. I knew that, but it's only when you're in it that you really realise the depth of it. So, going through my career, the thing that always struck me was how surprised people were that I could articulate any given point on
You're so
whatever.
eloquent, Beth.
So eloquent. So eloquent.
Yeah, we've all had that.
Oh, absolutely. To the point where I can remember a journalist from a certain newspaper saying, why on earth would you sing R&B music? I mean, that's just guys with their pants hanging down, isn't it? And I was like, oh, okay. And this was in relation to the Mobo Awards. This was when the Mobo Awards just, you know, every little publicity they got was invariably negative. It had to have a negative light on it, you know. And I was just so flabbergasted that, you know, that was the approach.
Did you ever feel that the colour of your skin held you back, so people were holding you back because you had dark skin? Did you feel as though they were finding you difficult to market because you had darker skin?
Yes, I'm glad you said that, the difficult to market thing. I remember a wonderful singer who is sadly no longer with us, a British guy, who I remember his whole team having a discussion about how difficult he was to market because he was dark-skinned. And he looked like a bloody model. I mean, he was gorgeous, but anyway. But for myself, I didn't look exotic. Do you know what I mean? I wasn't of a lighter skin with straighter hair and all the thing. I looked how I looked, and I was quite happy with what I saw looking back in the mirror. Thank you very much, and I was even happy with what came out. I always wanted to steer whoever I was working with to focus on the music and the talent, but it always seemed to come back to other factors. And because I was very confident, I would speak up for myself because I could, because I was articulate. So I wasn't scared of saying, actually, I think this production is not right. We need to clean it up. It needs to be simple. We need this and that. And I could, I'd speak up for myself with no apology. People would find me uppity, and I could
like
be
an aggressive
disagreeable.
black woman, perhaps?
Yeah, that trope. I never got told I was aggressive regularly, but I was on a couple of occasions told, you perhaps need to tone that down. Tone what down? What, giving my opinion on my own songs that I wrote? Yeah, that's not going to happen. Okay, then. I never shied away from being resolutely myself.
Yeah.
And I think that's the reason my journey in music was a slower build, because I just would not, relent.
Yeah.
I wouldn't bend. If I thought that this should sound like this, then that's what it should sound like. I just wouldn't have it. You have, in the music industry, you're fighting a war on two fronts. You're fighting the stereotyping of women in general, and you can imagine everything is based on what you look like, you're there for titillation, you're the fluff piece, all that kind of stuff. And then there's the racial stereotypes, the aggressive black woman, you're gonna be difficult, you're all that all day long, and it becomes tiring. The digital lightening of pictures, the just tweaking the nose to make it a little smaller. The digital lightening of pictures happened right off the bat. And I remember I could still look at my first album and think, it looks like me, sort of, kind of, way lighter. That's not what I look like. There's so much that just surrounds that world, People not knowing how to deal with your hair. People not being around to deal with your makeup. You're smiling because you know.
Oh, been there, Bev. Yeah.
The makeup issue was crazy. I can remember going on different TV shows and just knowing there'd be no one to deal with my makeup, even though it's just a matter of having the right product and applying it.
It's somebody doing their job.
It's just really
that
easy.
Is somebody's job.
So I would just do it all myself,
Yeah.
So it's from the microaggressions right the way to the more overt things. And it got tiring, but I was so confident in myself, thank you, Mum and Dad. I had that grounding, so I would always disarm people in a charming way. Say my truth with a smile.
With a smile.
Because we don't want to make you feel uncomfortable, but we're going to tell you the truth. And that was my way of navigating everything.
Is anything that Bev said, Oswald, in terms of being charming and trying to navigate the entertainment industry, are there any parallels that you can see with yourself and the fashion industry in navigating that?
Yeah, definitely. In fact, learning how to navigate and using your charm is the only ingredient to actually surviving it and actually achieving what you want to achieve, which is, recognition and developing your business. So yes, I completely agree with that. I mean, in my business, it's interesting enough in fashion, because I started in the 80s, and there was a very interesting fashion movement called Buffalo, and it was very inclusive. So in a way, I came in the industry I was actually accepted as a creative because of the way that, in that moment, that time in history, what was going on, right? But I was very clear about my personal mission, right? And so, even though there was an acceptance, and there was, yes, there was, I was still dealing with the racism every day with the sus laws and all that stuff, but there was an openness to just pure creative talent. And so, so that's kind of was a door open that made me feel, okay, this is the right door to go into. I decided on making my name around the suit because I knew what that meant. And so that was in a way, my political statement, you know. It's interesting.
Did people try and discourage you from doing that? Sorry to interrupt.
Sorry?
Did people try to discourage you from doing that?
I mean, if they did, I didn't hear them. You know, I mean, that's the other thing is that when I was growing up, you learn to absorb, and then you just keep your focus on the target. So regardless of what you've been told, you're not really hearing what's negative. You're going with what's positive, because if you focus on that, you're not going anywhere. I mean, the interesting thing is talking about my schooling. This is an interesting point. Is that I remember I was maybe 10 years old. We had a modern history, and we had to do an essay, right, on Kwame Nkrumah, right? So I'm originally from Ghana, and Kwame Nkrumah was responsible for getting independence for Ghana and most of sub-Saharan Africa. But in the history book, it was saying he was a corrupt, terrible leader. Now, my father was part of that movement of independence. And my father is a teacher, so he's a headmaster, pure academic. So I'm reading this history book. I go home to my dad, and my dad's like, well, that's not right. So I've got the facts because I've been brought up in a household, being educated in that way. So I write the essay, I go back to the school, and the teacher reads it, and they go, well, that's wrong. I'm saying, well, no, you're wrong. I'm 10 years old, right? And so we have a whole argument about this. And then my father gets involved, and it's a whole thing. But already at that point, I already understood that the books I was taught about my culture were factually incorrect.
Yeah.
And so I understood that it was already at an early age, there needed to be a shift in the system, in the structure of it. And so when I discovered I had a talent for designing clothes, it's funny because I kind of ended up in Savile Row by accident, because I was designing at that point, and the best place to open the store would be Covent Garden at that point. But then I understood that if I could get on Savile Row and make an impact on that street, I could affect the country's perspective of what it is to be black. So I had a very clear objective.
And I can remember hearing about your label and the fact that you were on Savile Row, feeling a sense of pride.
Yeah.
A huge sense of pride. Had never met you, but knew about you and knew about your clothes, and the fact that you were on Savile Row, just felt proud, hugely proud of you.
And how you respected cut, but gave it pizzazz. You know, you kind of blackened the text. I remember once I saw you with a tie, a Union Jack tie, and you'd coloured it in, and I said to you, you blackened the text, and you said to me, I never thought about it that way, but it's true. And it made people like me feel great pride, and you know the slickness of it too. But I think it's what we try and bring to the table, that energy, that this is who we are, to be respected, and that also inspires others.
Exactly.
Which I think is really important. I mean, we've been nurturing talent. We want black and brown faces in high places, but not just because they're black and brown, but because they've got something to give.
Exactly. And I think that
Meritocracy.
Yeah.
True meritocracy.
It is. I mean, it's saying that when we come to the table, with our history, with our resilience, with our creativity, with our prowess, musical prowess, sporting prowess, everybody benefits. And every juncture you talked about, how do we get from A to B to Z? What's critical? We have to take people along with us, and it's a skill how you navigate that. Because sometimes you just think to yourself, why don't you just get it? That fair is fair, right? Skill is skill, and yet we're not at that place. So we have to take people along on this journey. And at every juncture, we have to remind them, we're doing this for you too.
But that sense of pride is real, though. When you see somebody succeed, I remember though growing up in Reading, and every time Trevor McDonald came on, my dad used to call us into the front room.
Same,
to
same,
sort of
exactly the same.
Because it was that he was, and I grew up thinking he was a member of my family. There was such a sense of pride because when you see somebody recognised or seen or elevated, you know how much it took. You know how much it took.
Right.
You know that they have to be incredibly talented to have got to where they are. So you feel that sense of pride and you celebrate it. You absolutely celebrate it.
When you score,
Yes.
you score for us.
Look how good he had to be
Exactly
in order to get there. And
Right.
this is where sometimes even in the jobs in football, there's this big word at the moment about visibility. And I'm saying, well, visibility was 20, 30 years ago when you just had to have somebody who had a coaching badge, somebody who was there. At the moment, we have loads of people in all industries that are talented. And when we end up with these tick box situations where we're shoehorning people that are not talented, black, white, whatever, I think that actually dilutes the achievements of people who are truly talented. Because at the moment, talking about visibility really is obvious now. People are actually seeing you there, visible, and actually going around you to not give you the jobs or to not put you in situations. So we got to get rid of the words visibility and things like that, because I believe that there are so many talented people in this country that actually deserve to be in places of power, deserve to be in places of decision making, etc.
And in terms of visibility and talent, would you say that that's fiercely obvious within your industry when it comes to coaching and managing, for example, that there are superbly talented people like yourself, and you are coaching, superbly talented people like yourself, but so many people are being sidestepped, as you say, and choosing someone else to do it?
Well, that's something until we accept that just being visible is not enough. Until we accept that there are people in my industry. First things first. People used to say, well, you know, black players haven't got their badges, haven't got the qualifications. But since then, there's been initiatives that means that there's loads of black players, ex-players with their badges. I mean, I'll give you an example. They talk about the Rooney Rule right now. Obviously, we know that's an initiative that I wouldn't say forces people to interview people, but it means that people get through the door. Now, we understand it's not perfect and it needs monitoring. However, Ricky Hill, the ex-Luton player who played for England, I think he was the third black player to play for England, he was the one who actually introduced the concept to the stakeholders. Now, that was 2004, 2005. I went with him to the LMA and he introduced it. And since then, it took, I think, 13 or 14 years for it to be implemented. When they decided to do it in America, it took 4 months when they decided to do it. At that time, I was 42 years old. So loads of the players now who are in their 40s, they would have been 28, 30, 32. At that time, if they had thought that there was no chance of getting jobs, I'm sure they would be using their platform in the same way that Raheem Sterling and Rashford are using. They would have had a scream up back then. But everybody thought, well, we're going to put things into place and there will be jobs. So now I'm, 58 now. So if you were in your 40s back then, you haven't had a career based on waiting for these initiatives to happen.
4 years it took in the States, 14 years here. Why do you think that's 4 months, sorry. Why do you think that is?
Because we talk about this evolution all the time. We keep talking about it all the time. I make a statement. If the elephants were waiting for this evolution to happen, they would still have woolly coats. Because there's no way that we can wait this long for British black ex-players to get jobs in clubs, get jobs in the boardroom without losing generations. And what we've done is we've lost a generation now. Anybody who's above 55, 60 has not had a career based on waiting for these initiatives.
And how does that make them, how does it make them feel? You know you're good enough to do it, and yet they keep bypassing you and going to someone else. And yet you see people who are less qualified than you, who are not black, and they're able to, in some cases, waltz into jobs.
Because you've got too many eye rollers. You know, here we go again, not this again. And that's the problem that you have. And what you have, unless you get people who are white, who are not racist, but because they're not racist, they don't realise that their integrity is not everybody's integrity.
It's the lack of political will. I mean, you need somebody to be able to take away their blinkers and see talent. Because, when back in the day, black people, we had all the skill, but they said we couldn't play in winter. Or we couldn't defend, right? And it's the truth. It's the truth. It's the truth. It's the truth. And now they're saying we can't manage, or we can't be CEOs, or we can't have a shop in Savile Row. We can do all of that.
Of course.
And it's getting past that prejudice, that moment. And people have to be honest about the baggage that we all hold.
Yeah.
Because when you strip that bare and you acknowledge it, and then you can put it aside, then you can start seeing talent.
I agree.
And that too many people have been cast aside, and I really lament with football, because you look at the footballers' Premiership, about a third or more are the entertainers, of course, and yet we're not allowed to govern. We're not on the boards, on these CEOs. How many black CEOs do we have in the FTSE 100, Karen?
One.
That's mad.
And when you have situations such as that, being the position that you are, Karen, and you've worked phenomenally hard to get to where you are at, that couldn't have come easy at all. You would have come across those barriers.
Yeah.
And are there barriers that wouldn't have existed for other people?
Look, I think people hire in their own mirror image, don't they? And when I entered my industry, which is the advertising industry, and I entered it in the early 90s, and there's this, when I talk about this and I do presentations about it, I've got a picture of all of the leaders in my industry, from advertising agencies to media agencies, so all of the leaders, and they were predominantly white men with one white woman. And I'm looking at that in the early 90s thinking, well, I need to make sure that these people know that my fingerprints are on some of the work that they admire. I need to make sure that these people, regardless of not knowing me as an individual, know what I'm capable of. Because I'm probably going to be very different to these people. We've had a very different life experience. And when it comes to, the next pitch team, the next promotion, the next whatever it may be, conscious and unconscious bias exists. It does. You put somebody in the place that they've got a rapport with, or they've hung out with, or they've worked with before. If you've not had an opportunity to sort of work with one of the people, you're not going to get that role and that elevation. So I worked out from a very, because I do branding, I do marketing, so worked out, actually, in order for me to be seen and my talent to be seen, people have to know what my brand is, so that when you put me on a team, what you're going to get. And it might not be to everybody's flavour or taste, but you'll know what you'll get. And I couldn't have got to where I am without some brilliant allies and without some brilliant sponsors. For people that didn't realise I was a woman or didn't realise I was black, they just saw somebody that could win and somebody that was talented. And so they would advocate for me in the rooms that I did not have access to, that I was not invited into. They would just talk about, well, Karen can do this. I know that she'll be able to do X. And we sort of talked about that need to sort of be able to manoeuvre. I have learnt to flex my style. I'm still who I am, and I'm still true to who I am. But I think more than anyone, we've had to learn to dial things up and dial things down, and know when to do it in order to make sure that you're invited into rooms, in order to make sure that you have a seat on a table. So it's not changing who you are, but it's having that flexibility in your communication style.
I think it's antennae. It's having that antennae.
It is. That's exactly what it is. It's like a Jedi mind trick.
Right.
It's this duality of existence that we all of us, we all know, we've all got it, and we know instantly when we walk into a situation, you know,
how to judge it.
How to straight away, you know how you should be speaking, how you should hold yourself, everything.
How to make people feel comfortable.
Exactly.
And once you've made them feel comfortable, I mean, actually, you can make them feel too comfortable. And then
Which
there
is
was
why the problems perpetuate.
And then they will say, you know these black kids, and you just thought to yourself, hang on a second.
yeah.
Because you've made them feel
But I don't
too
mean
comfortable.
you, though. I don't mean you.
You're one of the good
Exactly.
ones.
But then, so you have that as your skill. But then you need to know when to point the finger. Now, behave yourself. And this is the journey we need to get on together. And then they're nodding with you. And then actually they then become your cheerleaders.
Absolutely
They
right.
then open doors for you.
Absolutely.
And they say, Karen, she's brilliant. Oswald is fantastic.
Yeah.
And then we have to be mindful about taking others along with us too.
With us, that's right.
But you also have to be mindful that you can't mess it up.
Right.
You cannot mess it up because
No.
there are no second chances.
They're really not.
When you get into those positions and you're seen and you're visible, there's no second chances. Somebody else that isn't black may get a second chance.
But why-
I know
why-
we
but
can't
why
have
isn't
a
there
second chance.
For me, in my industry, you have managers losing jobs after jobs and getting other jobs and other jobs.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so my narrative now isn't I need to be better than them. Can I be as bad as them?
I hear you.
Because
It's
ultimately, if other people are going to get jobs when they haven't succeeded,
Yeah.
why shouldn't I get another job when I haven't? Don't forget, we're all British, so we should be treated with the same
I totally agree,
rules
but you know that's
and
not
care.
the narrative.
Of
You
course,
know that's not the narrative.
Totally right.
This
But-
is the problem.
But until we get to the point when we're allowed to fail and then be given another
We're allowed
chance.
to fail up.
Yeah, exactly.
So many people who, when you're not black, you're allowed to fail up countless
of course
times.
you
And
are.
you're right. When it comes to managers in football, I mean, that's demonstrative every single year that happens. And you're right, with the likes of Chris Hughton, for example, his journey hasn't been like Mourinho, for example.
But for argument's sake, your ability might be that high that you probably don't fail very often. So and that's you as a person. So what I'm saying is, but there's people, say like myself, who would have had a job, and maybe I'm not brilliant, but I'm as good as the other person
Or
who's
maybe
failed.
you are. Or maybe you are, but you've never been given the opportunity to show your
Fail again,
brilliance.
Exactly.
to try again.
Which is,
Simon, I want to talk about politics.
yeah.
And would you say, you've got those who are riding high in a lot of industries, in entertainment, for example, and in sport, for example, players as well doing really well. In politics, do you think that they are doing well in terms of getting more black people in the higher echelons, or do you think they've become a bit lazy?
Well, when we started, 1996, there were 4 black and minority ethnic MPs. Now there are over 60. I mean, there's a kind of an evolution to this too, because first of all, you had a lot of MPs, and they almost said to themselves, "I better keep my head down, better downplay my blackness." Except Bernie Grant, of course, Bernie Grant, Diane Abbott, he would come in with his African outfit and tell him, "You know who I am. Remember." And he wore his colour, he wore his Africanness on his heart. Really, on his sleeve and in his heart. But there are others that go in there and they think, I need to talk a certain way, I don't want to talk about race. They're almost frightened of their own shadow. You need a critical mass, and we're not there yet. A critical mass, a bit like you say, Chris, for people to be good, bad, or indifferent. But the expectation is so high on black politicians to be incredibly successful. And it's just not possible. I mean, the other point is that as voters, we've got to start making more demands. And then that can push white MPs to confront racism too. It's not just black MPs that have to take on this full responsibility.
Would you say, well, I would say that people have become a little bit more outspoken as a result of the protests over the past few weeks. People feel emboldened to be able to be honest about their experiences.
Yeah.
Do you think that will end up having an impact on politics?
I hope so. I mean, right now there's a perfect storm. On one side of the storm, COVID-19 and the devastating impact it's had on black lives. 90% of doctors, non-white, nurses, porters, bus drivers. And the other side is the death of George Floyd that we're seeing right in front of our eyes.
Yeah.
I think the biggest thing about this is that in my time, maybe our time, is it the first time that white society have seen these 2 events and said that couldn't happen to us the way it's happening to black people? And I think because part of our challenge is getting white people to see life through our lens and all the prejudices.
Yeah, absolutely.
But right now, they're seeing that. They're seeing George Floyd and saying, a white person would say, that couldn't happen to me. And in that moment, there's a potential for a sea change, because people are, white and black kids are going on the street and saying, structurally, things have to change. Our education, the employment, housing, politics. It's a moment. I hope that we'll seize it. I hope that there'll be transformative change. We had this conversation before. You know, will people get weary anytime soon? Or is it a moment to have the big change that we'd like to see?
No, this is definitely a turning point, because we wouldn't be having this conversation. I mean, I don't even think it was even possible to have this conversation. Even myself, I'm more vocal about the position more than any time in my entire life.
Wow.
Yeah.
You know, I'd never talk about my experience as a kid being, trying to get to school. I mean, I've never spoken about this, because that was not the
right time.
Not even the time. It was just not the thing to be said.
Well, you knew, you could already feel the eye rolls
Yeah,
behind
yeah.
you before you'd even
exactly.
opened your mouth.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
you wouldn't go there with that. But
Yeah.
for me, this moment, and this is interesting because you mentioned COVID.
Yeah.
Because I spent 3 months trapped in my house or whatever it was. So I did a lot of kind of internal work.
Yeah.
And I think the combination of the kind of internal work that we've all gone through during this period, because there's no doubt that being trapped in your house is definitely going to do something, right?
Yeah.
On a spiritual level, is the combination of that and the death of George Floyd, which basically you got a 40-plus man,
Fit man.
who is
Despite the first autopsy.
who is crying for his mother.
I mean, that
While
broke
this
my
man
heart.
is choking him to death with his hand in his pocket, like he's ordering a cappuccino. Now, this for me on a personal level, that broke a 1,000 pieces inside me, which is why this cannot be just a conversation.
Yeah.
It now needs to be an action. I'm very much of the opinion that reparations need to be paid on black slavery. And I think that, and it's not even a question of money, it's an acknowledgement of wrong. Right?
Yeah.
The factor is it was wrong. We know that the whole system of this country, the banking, everything's been built off the back of slavery. And there has to be an acknowledgement of the fact that it was wrong and an acceptance of it. There's no need now to kind of doctor the history of it. I mean, the great thing with social media, all the facts are coming out. We all know the story. We know that the slave traders were compensated. Something in the region of £300 billion today's money. So there needs to be an acknowledgement of that, and there needs to be action. And I think it would be a real mistake for British society not to acknowledge that. I mean, it doesn't even make sense. Because if you know it's wrong, you can't, I mean, how does that work? I mean, I don't understand.
There is, I think, to take what Oswald's saying, at the heart of everything that we're talking about, if you strip it all away, for me it boils down to one word, and that's honesty. Because you cannot move forward, we cannot move forward as a British people, and as a society, we cannot expect societal change if we are not honest about what has happened in the past.
And how it's influenced.
And how it's influenced the now, so that we can make positive impact on the future. And it's not about, it's in my soul, I have to get this one out. It's not about trying to erase what has gone. It's not about trying to eradicate what's gone on. It's about having the whole truth on the table.
Exactly.
The whole truth. And an acknowledgement of the whole truth.
But the important element of that is this. If we are to get buy-in from it, is that we've got to have this journey in which we lay bare these uncomfortable truths that still influence today. But we're saying the journey for tomorrow will benefit everyone.
Yes.
It's everyone.
Yeah,
Everyone comes with.
But that's an obvious conclusion.
It's an obvious to us.
But it's an obvious conclusion because
should
it should be.
It
but
should be
it's-
to everyone.
But it isn't.
But it's
It isn't, because they will be seen as, oh, these black people, you know, I wasn't around in slavery. Why am I paying this? Why is
you're
it?
paying-
What's it got to do with
Well,
me?
I
We
can
all were
answer that.
paying it
I can-
until 2015.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We were all paying it.
Karen, in terms of the movement, which Oswald says is the reason why we're sat here in this room, which is the reason why so many people feel like they can be honest about their experiences now. Where do you sit where the movement is concerned?
Look, I totally agree. I think there is a moment in time. I think that where I am confident is because of the younger generation just not having any of it.
Yeah,
So
that's
whereas,
true.
Black and white.
whereas absolutely,
Absolutely right.
so whereas, you know, my generation, older generations, we put up with that inequality, that systemic inequality, and we learned how to work within the system.
Yeah.
And we learned how to make sure that we still progress, that we still achieve within a system that's not equal. The younger generation are just, no, just not. And so I have lots of hope for the future in terms of where we go. I have lots of hope that this is not a black issue, it's a societal issue, and that we're seeing all people from all backgrounds come together. And from my, you know, industry and looking at business, leaders going, do you know what? We've not done enough. We've not done enough. We think we've done things, but actually, because we were trapped in our houses, because the whole world saw, because let's face it, it's not the first time we've seen a black man killed on camera. It's not. It's not the first time.
That is exactly the point.
Rodney King, exactly, in the 90s. So it's not the first time, but this time it's different. This time because we're all watching, we're all at home,
We were
and I think we
captive
have moved on as a society since the early 90s. So I'm seeing business leaders thinking, do you know what? We need to do more, and looking and really looking at their own businesses.
I want to say something. It's funny because I went on one of the marches, and I went with my daughter and a few of her friends, and what I was surprised by was the fact it was a majority white people were marching, and I was standing with my mask, and then I heard someone behind me saying, no justice, no peace, but screaming at the top of their voice. And I turned around, and he was a white kid. I think he must have been 13 or 14 years old.
Wow.
And he was screaming louder than me. And I stood there with sheer amazement of that. And so, without a question, the younger generation are just not having it.
Yeah.
And Chris, obviously within a football context, you've got footballers taking the knee.
Yeah, I think it was really important at QPR. We took the knee at one of our first training sessions, and I think everybody was happy to do it. We gave them the option. You know, no one's going to judge anybody for doing it. But I believe that football has a massive platform in the world, and we talk about not including politics in sport, but unfortunately that they're entwined. So I think it's important that football does lead the way in making sure that the morality of their fans, the morality of the people that work within the sport, understand what's been going on worldwide. You know, it's not just an entertainment industry where people go play, get their money and go home. And I think, like you alluded to, Karen, people are just not having it. So the younger players now are opening their mouths, because in the old days, you know, you didn't earn a lot of money, so you got chloroformed to keep you from saying anything, and you needed the money, so it was important that you kept your mouth shut. But I think now people have got economic value, so people are not going to drop them when they're earning 40, 50,000 a week, when they cost 20, 30 million pound. So they can talk and be listened to straight away. Yeah. Social media, for its negative areas, has a lot of positive areas in regard to getting the messages out very quickly, and people being able to understand what people are going through very quickly. And I think that some of the young players now have led the way for the authorities. Yeah, you know.
Social media has led the way in the music industry in exactly the same sphere, in that the young people who are coming through now, they are not standing for nonsense. They're just not. You know, I was steaming when I heard first Misha B, you know, that whole shameful episode that happened to this 19-year-old girl in the gaze of the whole of the country, and then for Alex to then speak about, you know, being advised to bleach her skin. I wanted to reach through the screen and just hug her and say, my God, you know. But there is a younger generation of people who have come through now, who will absolutely, because they know their economic worth, which is why I find the correlation, they'll speak their truth, and they don't care, because they know they're generating their own money. They know what they're worth to the labels and whoever they're signed to. So, you know, Stormzy will go on in the newspaper and say, yeah, you know, this country still has an issue with racism, and they will still try and flip what he's saying and pretend he's saying something else that he's not saying. But he has the right to reply, because guess what? We've got social media now. This is the 21st century, and people are emboldened to speak truth and speak that truth to power, because they know those messages disseminate very quickly in the communities. And for me, it's an absolute joy, and I'm right behind all of it.
I think it's also important what you said about the honesty, about not eradicating things, about making sure that people remember, because it's important that when we educate the young members of our society, that the truth comes out. So it's not airbrushed into some of the stuff that we learn in history about what's going on. We still remind them that the whole Industrial Revolution was built on the cotton of the slaves and stuff like that. We make sure that they do understand where the history is coming from. So then when they make the noise, the relevant noises, that it's factual and honest.
Well, guys, that's all we've got time for.
Great.
Like an hour.
It
carried on there.
flew by. I've got to do a quick call.
Bess Elliot's, we're going, we've got to stop, because people have got to go.
Oh, it's been